The day my son handed me a cardboard box and told me to clear out my own office, I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, this man I had held in my arms the night he was born. This man I had taught to ride a bike in the driveway of our old house on Maple Creek Road, and I picked up the box, and I walked out. I had built Caldwell Engineering Solutions from a single drafting table in my garage. 31 years, 340 employees, bridges, water treatment plants, highway overpasses across 7 states. My wife Eleanor and I had poured everything we had into that company, our savings, our weekends, our anniversaries, our sleep. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, I kept going to the office every day because she told me to. She said, "Robert, if you sit here and watch me die, it'll kill you too. Go build something." So I did. I kept building. And every evening I came home and held her hand and told her what we were working on, and she would close her eyes and smile. Eleanor passed on a Thursday in March. The funeral was on a Monday. By Wednesday, my son Daniel had already scheduled a meeting with the board. I didn't know about that meeting until 2 weeks later. I found out the way you find out things you were never supposed to know by accident. Our office manager, Patricia, mentioned it while I was refilling my coffee. She thought I already knew. She turned white when she realized I didn't. I want you to understand something about Daniel before I go further, because this story is not really about a villain. It's about something quieter and more painful than that. Daniel was a good boy. He really was. Smart, thoughtful, curious about the world. He got his MBA from Wharton, came back and joined the company 8 years ago, and he worked hard. I promoted him to COO 2 years in because he earned it. The problem was not Daniel. The problem was Megan. Megan had grown up with money and lost it. Her family's textile business collapsed when she was in college, and she had spent every year since trying to get back to where she started. She was not a bad person either. Not exactly. She was just terrified of being poor again. And fear, I have learned, makes people do things they never imagined themselves capable of. After Eleanor died, Megan started working on Daniel. I did not see it happening because I was grieving and because I trusted my son. Later, Patricia would tell me the things Megan had said at company dinners, at board lunches, in quiet conversations with investors, that I was losing my edge, that I had been emotionally compromised by Eleanor's illness for over a year, that the company needed fresh leadership to move into the next decade. She was not wrong about all of it. I had been distracted. But there is a difference between suggesting your father-in-law take a step back and orchestrating a quiet removal. The board meeting I wasn't invited to resulted in a resolution recommending that I transition out of the CEO role. They framed it as a retirement. Daniel presented it to me on a Tuesday afternoon in my own office, the corner office, with the windows looking out over downtown Charlotte, the same office where I had signed our first $1 million contract, where I had called Eleanor from the phone on that desk to tell her we had made it. He sat across from me and slid a folder across the desk, and he said, "Dad, the board thinks it's time. You've given so much. You deserve to rest." I looked at that folder for a long moment. Then I looked at my son. His eyes slid away from mine. I said, "Did Megan write this speech, or did you?" He didn't answer. I signed the transition agreement. I moved out of my office into a smaller advisory role with a title that meant nothing. And 3 months later, Daniel came back with another folder, a buyout offer for my shares. 32% of the company Eleanor and I had built. The valuation they used was from a period when we had taken a loss during supply chain disruptions. It was not a fair offer. It was not even close to a fair offer. But attached to it was a letter. And the letter said that if I did not accept, the board would move to a vote of no confidence in my advisory position, effectively removing me entirely and creating a dispute that would unfortunately require legal review of certain expenditures made during my tenure. They were threatening me, in my own company, with fabricated concerns about my own accounting. I sat in that smaller office, my name wasn't even on the door anymore, and I read that letter twice. Then I put it in my desk drawer and I called a number I had not called in 11 years. Her name was Sarah. She was my daughter from my first marriage, before Eleanor. Sarah and I had a complicated history. Her mother and I divorced when Sarah was 7. There was bitterness on all sides, and by the time Sarah was in her 20s, we had drifted into the kind of silence that feels permanent. I had sent birthday cards. She had sent short replies. We were strangers who shared blood. But Sarah was a corporate attorney, one of the best in her field, as it turned out. She worked out of a firm in Boston that specialized in shareholder rights and breach of fiduciary duty. I had followed her career from a distance the way you follow someone you love who doesn't know you're watching. She picked up on the third ring. I said, "Sarah, it's your father. I need help, and I don't deserve to ask, but I'm asking anyway." There was a silence long enough that I thought she might hang up. Then she said, "Tell me what's happening." I told her everything. The board meeting I wasn't invited to, the forced transition, the lowball buyout offer, the threatening letter about my expenditures. I talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and when I finished, there was another silence. And then she said, "Dad, don't sign anything. Don't respond to the letter. Don't say a word to Daniel or to anyone at the company. Can you do that?" I said yes. She said, "I'm flying down on Friday." What Sarah found when she started digging took my breath away, not because of what Daniel and Megan had done, but because of what Eleanor had already done, years before any of this started. Eleanor had been a careful woman, careful and quiet and 10 steps ahead of everyone in any room she entered. She had loved Daniel fiercely, but she had also known him completely, and she had known Megan even better than Daniel knew himself. 2 years before her diagnosis, Eleanor had gone to see our company attorney, a man named Gerald Hartwell, and she had made changes to the foundational shareholder agreement, changes that had never been communicated to Daniel, changes buried in a document revision that looked routine on its face. The original shareholder agreement gave both Eleanor and me equal founding shareholder status, with special provisions for the surviving spouse. Standard enough. What Eleanor added was a clause, Clause 14, subsection C, which Gerald later described to me as the most elegant piece of corporate self-defense I have ever drafted for a client. The clause stated that in the event either founding shareholder was compelled through board action, legal threat, or material pressure to accept a buyout at below fair market value, the compelled sale would be null and void, and the pressuring party's voting rights would be suspended pending independent arbitration. Furthermore, if the pressure originated from a current officer of the company, and officer was defined to include the CEO, that officer's equity position would be subject to a forced dilution of up to 40%, redistributed to the founding shareholders' trust. Eleanor had written a trap, and Daniel had walked straight into it. Sarah explained all of this to me on a Friday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with Gerald on speakerphone, a pot of coffee between us that neither of us touched. I listened to her voice, my daughter's voice, which I had not heard in person in 11 years, explain the legal architecture my wife had built to protect me, and I had to press my hand flat on the table to keep myself steady. I said, "She never told me." Sarah said quietly, "She probably didn't want you to worry." I said, "She knew this might happen." Gerald said, "She knew it was possible." Eleanor was nothing if not thorough. We did not respond to Daniel's letter immediately. Sarah wanted to wait, to let them escalate. She said the more pressure they applied, the stronger our position became under Clause 14. She was right. 3 weeks after the buyout letter, Daniel's attorney sent a formal demand, a harder version of the same threat, this time explicitly referencing the no-confidence vote as imminent. On a Monday morning, Sarah walked into Caldwell Engineering Solutions' main conference room with Gerald and 2 associates from her firm. They had requested the meeting under the shareholder agreement's mandatory mediation provision, another clause Daniel's lawyers apparently hadn't read carefully. Daniel was there with Megan sitting behind him, and 2 board members, and their attorney, a man named Preston, who had the practiced confidence of someone who had never been surprised in a meeting. I sat across from my son for the first time in 6 weeks. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes I hadn't seen before. For a moment I felt the old pull of fatherhood, the instinct to ask if he was sleeping, if he was eating, if something was wrong. Then I remembered the cardboard box. I looked away. Sarah placed a copy of the shareholder agreement in front of Preston and opened it to page 47. She said, "I'd like to draw your attention to Clause 14, subsection C." Preston glanced at it. Then he looked again. I watched his face change the way a face changes when the ground shifts unexpectedly under it, a flicker of something behind the eyes, recalculation happening faster than expression can follow. Megan leaned forward and whispered something to Daniel. Daniel said, "What is this?" Sarah said, "This is the agreement your father signed as a founding shareholder in 1994, with amendments filed in 2019. The amendments were properly noticed to the board secretary at that time. Would you like me to produce the filing receipt?" Preston said, slowly. "We'll need time to review this." Sarah said, "Of course. However, I want to note for the record that the demand letter sent on October 14th constitutes, in our reading, a triggering event under subsection C. That means the clock has already started. The clock she was referring to was a 30-day window during which, under the clause, the pressuring officer Daniel could remedy the situation by withdrawing the demand and restoring my advisory role with full original compensation. If he did not, the dilution mechanism activated automatically. Megan said, "This is insane. This can't be enforceable." Sarah looked at her very calmly and said, "You're welcome to test that in court, though I'd note that a dilution proceeding would require full financial discovery, which would include the board communications from the past 18 months. She paused. All of them. The room was quiet. I had not planned to speak. Sarah had told me not to, and I had agreed. But I looked at my son sitting across from me, his face confused and frightened in a way I hadn't seen since he was a child, and I broke the rule. I said, "Daniel, I don't want this." He looked at me. I said, "I never wanted any of this. I wanted to run my company and then hand it to you when the time was right, when you were ready and I was ready. That's all I ever wanted. Your mother wanted the same thing. This," I gestured at the lawyers, "the documents, the whole miserable room is not what either of us imagined." His jaw worked. He didn't say anything. I said, "But I will not be threatened out of what your mother and I built. Not by anyone." We left without a resolution that day, but Preston called Gerald that evening. The tone had changed completely. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah negotiated a settlement that I would not have believed possible in that Monday morning conference room. My advisory role was restored with a title that actually meant something, Chairman Emeritus, with board observation rights and veto power over any transaction exceeding $15 million. The buyout offer was rescinded, and a new independent valuation of my shares was commissioned, one that came back 40% higher than the number on Daniel's original offer. Daniel did not lose his CEO position. I did not ask for that. He was my son, and whatever Megan had pushed him toward, I believed he was capable of being better. But 2 board members, who had voted for the no-confidence resolution, resigned under pressure from the dilution threat, and their replacements were selected through a process Sarah negotiated, one that gave me meaningful input. Megan called me herself, 2 weeks after the settlement. I almost didn't answer, but I did. She didn't apologize exactly. She said, "I panicked. After my family lost everything, I just couldn't stand the thought of us being vulnerable. I thought if Daniel had full control, we'd be safe." She paused. "I know that's not an excuse." I said, "No, it's not." Another pause. She said, "Is there any way back from this?" I thought about Eleanor, about what she would have said. Eleanor had never been a person who believed in permanent ruptures. She believed in long, hard winters and the possibility of spring on the other side. I said, "There might be, but it's going to take time, and it's going to have to come from Daniel, not from a lawyer, not from a letter, from your husband, sitting in my kitchen, talking to me like a son." She said she understood. Daniel came to the house 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning. He sat at the same kitchen table where Sarah and I had sat with Gerald and the cold coffee. He was alone. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in months. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know how to say it bigger than that. I'm sorry." I poured him a cup of coffee. I sat down across from him. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The way you look at someone when you're deciding something important. I said, "Your mother would have forgiven you already." He pressed his lips together. His eyes went red. I said, "I'm not your mother, so I'm going to need more time. But I'm willing to try. That's the best I can offer you right now." He nodded. He couldn't speak. We sat there for a while, the 2 of us, with our coffee going cold. Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree Eleanor had planted in the backyard 30 years ago was just beginning to turn first yellows at the edge of the leaves, the season changing the way it always does, slowly and then all at once. Sarah stayed for 2 weeks. She slept in the guest room, and we had dinner together every night and talked, really talked, about her mother, about my regrets, about the years we had let slide past without repair. On her last evening, we sat on the back porch after dinner, and she said, "Mom would have liked this. Us. Finally." I said, "Your mom always thought we'd get here." I was the one who doubted. She said, "You were stubborn." I said, "I was." She laughed. It was a laugh I recognized. It had Eleanor's cadence, that same quick brightness. I hadn't heard it in over a decade. And sitting there in the September evening with the yard going dark around us, I was overwhelmed by a gratitude so large I didn't have a word for it. Gratitude for second chances, for daughters who pick up the phone, for wives who plan 11 years ahead and love you quietly enough to build you a safety net without ever letting you know it was there. I went back to the office on the first Monday of October. Not every day. I was 68 years old and I had earned a slower pace, and I was honest enough with myself to admit it. But 2 days a week, I walked into Caldwell Engineering Solutions, nodded at Patricia, poured myself a coffee, and sat in the boardroom with my chairman emeritus nameplate on the table in front of me, and I was present for the work my company was doing in the world. Daniel and I were not back to what we were. I don't know if we will ever be, exactly. There is a kind of trust that, once broken, knits back together differently, not weaker necessarily, but different, like a bone that heals with a slight change in angle. We were learning the new shape of us. But at Thanksgiving, he and Megan came for dinner. Sarah flew in from Boston. My granddaughter Emma, who was 6 and had no idea what any of the adults had been through, ran around the backyard in the November cold and demanded that Grandpa Robert push her on the tire swing for the 11th time, and I did, because what else would I do? I am not a man who believes in neat endings. Life does not work that way, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But I believe in Eleanor, in the careful, quiet love she had for me, a love thorough enough to protect me from a threat she never even named, from a future she hoped would never come but prepared for anyway. I believe that was real. I believe it mattered. And I believe that when you build something with your whole life and someone tries to take it from you, the most powerful thing is not anger. It is not revenge. It is having done the work every day for 31 years so that when the moment comes, you are already standing on solid ground. I was.